It was very difficult, and the Italian contractor who undertook the dismantling and re-erection tackled it in a very, very careful and scientific way. All the stones were carefully marked and located before they were moved. He took great care to see that they were properly supported so that they didn't crack in moving. And such stones as were already cracked were repaired as they lay in the storage yard before they were put back in the re-erected monuments.
How many stones altogether had to be marked and moved in this way?
About 40,000 in the monuments and another 20,000 or more in the pavements.
What about the damage when all this was going on?
There was almost no damage to the stones in the moving operation. Obviously, some of them had been waterlogged and had been softened, but the ones that were cracked were taken very carefully to the storage yard and there repaired. Where they were big stones, holes were drilled and there was a stainless steel rod put in, and in other cases they were fixed together with epoxy resins.
Some of those stones are very big indeed. One you pointed out was a good 30 tons. And that was in a difficult position, you were saying. You couldn't get one of those huge cranes in there to lift it. So how did you get it into position?
That's right. It's in the middle of one of the temples. So it was put into position on the ground. Then a scaffold was built and it was jacked up into the air, and the other blocks re-erected below it and the big stone lowered onto them.
The ancient Egyptians, of course, didn't have cranes.
No.
Did you form a certain sneaking regard for the way they did all this?
We formed a great regard for it, and as an engineer it was an extremely interesting job from this point of view.
Looking around the island, I do notice in many places evidence of modern building materials. Concrete, that's had to be used in some cases. What was your criteria for using concrete?
It was used mainly in foundations. You may appreciate that Philae Island was not a rocky island initially, and many of the temples were built on rather poor foundations. They're on considerably better foundations now.
From where we stood, we could see the double ring of steel piles breaking the surface of the water, the coffer dam that protected Philae while its precious cargo was lifted off. The dam, in fact, cut across one end of the island, leaving three important monuments still submerged: Diocletian's Gateway, the Temple of Augustus, and the Temple of Herentates, which lay in deeper water at the northern end of the island. Enlarging the steel coffer dam to embrace them as well would have doubled the costs, so Egyptian and British Royal Navy divers were called in to dismantle the buildings underwater.
They had a very big problem initially because the whole thing was covered with sand and silt. It wasn't just a question of lifting stones out of the water, so that they had to remove as much as possible of the sand and silt, then try and record where the stones were, and then lift them up. When they had found the stones, they surveyed them to see what position they were in, and then they attached slings to them and lifted them to the surface with an airbag, which is the way the divers normally lift heavy weights. When they got to the surface, they were towed to a pontoon and lifted out onto the deck.
Some of these stones must have been fairly heavy.
Not as heavy as the blocks in the main temples, but they must have been 400 or 500 weight at least.
How much did they have to move? How much of the Diocletian Gate was below the water?
It was all below the water at this stage, and of course it wasn't all there, and it still isn't all there, but they moved all that they could get at.
Experts like John Corney, a partner in the British consultancy of Sir Alexander Gibbon Partners, have watched over every phase of the project through to its completion less than 2 weeks ago. Dr. Arthur Edwards, a former keeper of Egyptian antiquities at the British Museum, was a member of the committee of archaeologists appointed by UNESCO and the Egyptian Ministry of Culture to advise on the historical accuracy of the move at every stage.
For one thing, the buildings are much more complete than they were. Over 2,000 blocks that had fallen over the last 1,000 years and got buried in the mud were recovered, and as many as possible of those were restored to their proper places. Again, of course, they are clean. The very minimum of restoration has been done, but of course all the stones have been cleaned. Also, there's one, I think, unbudgeted gain from it. the ancient Egyptians ideally would have liked to put these temples on Vega itself. When you look at it, you can see how terribly rugged the surface is, how impossible it would have been in ancient times to level that and build large temples like this on it. After all, with modern technology, the use of dynamite, it did take them 5 years, or nearly so, to level it before they could put these buildings up here.
So you were saying that Philae, the island of Philae, the original island, was second choice?
I wouldn't really say that it was quite a second choice. It was an appendage. But ideally, I think the Egyptians would have put the temples on Vega, and Ajokya being part of Vega in the old days, I think that something has been done now which the Egyptians themselves would have liked to do. Also, of course, there is the fact that 80 years or so ago, people were clamoring to have the temples moved from Philae, before it was submerged, onto this very island, and nothing could be done then. Well, it has been achieved now.
The goddess Isis, which the temple of Philae was built to celebrate, is one of the oldest Egyptian gods, whose origins go far beyond the development of Philae as a religious metropolis. Among many things, she was the goddess of love, and her cult spread out all along the Nile. Her influence extended to the remotest parts of the Roman Empire, and she even acquired a reputation for protecting seafarers. Diarists of the day record that Philae was on the ancient tourist circuit, with Romans doing the grand tour to Alexandria, Memphis, the pyramids, and then a trip up the Nile to take in Philae as well. They came to pay their respects to Isis, and to admire these same buildings that Dr. Edwards knows so well.
Actually, this is the oldest building now standing on the island. It is part of a temple, just a vestibule of a temple that was built by Nectanebes I in about 375, 380 BC. We don't, in fact, know when it was put on this spot. Originally, it must have been built somewhere else on the island, and there's an inscription just round the corner here, which tells us that Ptolemy Philadelphus restored the temple, and it doesn't say precisely what his restoration consisted of.
Mm-hmm. Turning round from the vestibule of this small temple on the edge of the island, we now have in front of us a vista of a good 100 yards with a columned courtyard taking us right up to that massive pylon, the main pylon of the island. What was this courtyard used for?
Well, you see, it wasn't simply constructed for architectural purposes, though in effect, of course, it improves the appearance of the pylon enormously. It was intended to accommodate the crowds at the festivals of Osiris and Isis. The most important festival was the one in the month of December. And in fact, written on the walls of this temple was a dramatic graffiti which described how the emissary of the king of Meroe had come here in the year 253 AD and had spent 8 days with the priests of Isis, eating, drinking beer, and drinking wine, and making merry with the local inhabitants.
So this was a regular festival?
It was, and indeed, as far as we know, they had to enlarge the court to accommodate the crowds. You see, where you see that colonnade there, all that was made up ground, and the island was extended out in that direction, westwards and also southwards, so that they could accommodate more people.
As we walk along the colonnade, it's interesting to look at these pillars. The columns are very different in character. There isn't one that's the same, is there?
No, indeed, and indeed, these you see just here are not finished. As you say, there are no two alike. They were carved by sculptors who came here after finishing their work at the temple at Edfu, and a few of them carved their names as graffiti beneath the capitals, so that we actually know the name of the sculptor who carved them, and that's something very unusual in Egyptian art.
So if we walk up these steps now towards the pylon in the inner temple, we come to a gateway, and on either side of the gateway there's a Christian cross.
Yes, the Coptic cross. And above this one, you have a Greek graffito, which tells us that this temple was converted into a Christian church by the bishop, Apar Theodorus. And that happened in about 537 A.D.
Did they make many alterations to the temple?
Well, of course, all the heathen figures, the pagan gods and so on, were taken away and they were taken to Constantinople. They put this altar, this granite altar that you can see on the right, and above it, that little apse.
Ah, yes, a sort of niche in the wall, just above the altar, which stands about 4 feet from the ground.
And of course, the Christians themselves left their graffiti here. There's one here, a very short one, just below the cross, isn't it? Here we are, which says, "The cross has conquered. It always conquers."
From here, we can look further into the temple and towards the sanctuary. It's several chambers in, and we walk deeper and deeper into the temple, and of course it gets darker and darker. There's a great deal of atmosphere in here, isn't there, as we approach the most holy part of the temple, where presumably the cult statue of Isis stood.
Yes, well, you see this block of granite. This was the support for the boat in which Isis was seated, and it was that statue that would be taken once every 10 days to the island of Bega.
What was the significance of that?
Well, she went to visit her husband, you see.
Osiris, who was buried there.
That's right.
We've walked now out of the main temple, through a gateway, and out onto the side of the temple, and you've brought us to an imposing gateway that appears to lead virtually nowhere but out onto the water.
That's true. The gateway was built by Hadrian, and in fact it has some of the most interesting reliefs and inscriptions of any of the buildings on the island, and they all relate to the tomb of Osiris, which was believed to be on the island of Bega. Now, if you look out through this doorway on the left, you will see this large rocky island, and somewhere on that, according to tradition, there was what at this time was regarded as the most important tomb of Osiris. The Greeks called it the Abaton, the inaccessible place. We don't know exactly where the tomb was situated, but it's such a rocky island that it seems the only possible place would have been in the southwest corner. Well, it was from there that they obtained a lot of the stone for the first dam at Aswan, and it's conceivable, no more than that without realizing it, they destroyed the tomb of Osiris.
But what about these reliefs and writings here? What do they represent?
Well, the one just immediately in front of us here on the right is perhaps the most interesting of the lot.